St Ermin's Hotel, which is not far from St James's Underground station, has a history of spies and espionage, and that's where I am today. And I'm going to be speaking with journalist and historian Rob Hutton, and we're going to be exploring some of the secrets of MI5 for the National Centre for Military Intelligence. Rob, it's great to be here with you today.
Yes, this is it's such an interesting historical place. SOE do their recruiting here during the war. I think MI6 as well. All sorts of fun happened right where we are.
So we're in a great place to talk about MI5, and can you give me a bit of a backdrop to what we're going to speak? Because we're going to speak about something you've written and researched about Agent Jack. But what about MI5? What threats did MI5 face in the 1930s and, of course, into the Second World War?
So the simplistic version of this is that MI6 spies on people abroad and MI5 is responsible for domestic security. Now, because Britain is an empire, domestic security includes all the countries in the empire, so it includes India, which is obviously actually sort of quite a large country that we would now think of as abroad. But for our purposes, MI5 is responsible for stopping other people spying on Britain and for what's called so that's counter-espionage, and also for what's called counter-subversion, which is dealing with internal threats. So for a lot of the 1920s and 30s, they are worrying about communism. The Communist Party in Russia was committed to encouraging communist revolutions elsewhere around the world. There was in Britain a very genuine sense, certainly in the 1920s, that a revolution like that might be just around the corner. So that's MI5 is spying on these people. It's following these people. It's keeping files on all of them. It's reading their letters. That's their main tool for investigation in the 20s and 30s is reading letters. And there's a little post office factory in London where dozens of people sit with little steaming kettles, steaming open letters, photographing the contents, and then resealing them and sending them on their way.
So the recipient would never know that the mail had been opened before they received it?
That was the general idea. Some of them may well have had suspicions.
Yeah.
But no, that was in the 20s. That was the main way that people communicated, and so that was the way that you spied on them.
Because there's an additional threat, isn't there, in the 30s with the rise of fascism? In
the early 30s, the British government actually is fairly ambivalent about fascism. When Mussolini first takes over in Italy, Winston Churchill is an admirer. And even when Hitler takes over in Germany, there's a bit of a sense in the British government that Germany had been a chaotic country, that if you're worried about communism, fascism feels a bit like the solution. And because fascists are anti-communist. And Guy Liddell, who is then a rising star in MI5, actually goes to visit Nazi Germany in the early years, and is probably not as disturbed as he ought to have been, sort of with their counter-subversion efforts. So there is a sense that fascism is something they're not that worried about. And then that changes in the mid-30s when Oswald Mosley has his Olympia rally.
And he's, of course, leader of the British Union of Fascists.
Oswald Mosley has by this point been a Conservative MP and a Labour MP, and he is now the leader of the British Union of Fascists. He has his black shirt, and he has these rallies around the country. And politics in the 20s and 30s is really violent, partly because there were an awful lot of men who'd come back from war and who were used to solving problems with violence. So even at a sort of mainstream party meeting, you might well expect a fight to break out. And you might well, as a Conservative MP or a Labour MP, make sure you had some heavies around your meeting to stop the other heavies who might try to disrupt your meeting. So that's kind of the background to all of this. But the British Union of Fascists has more violence at their meetings, and when they hold this big Olympia rally, it's attended by a lot of churchmen and members of parliament, and they realise that the violence is the point. So when a heckler stands up to heckle Mosley, the spotlight will swing onto them, and that person will be grabbed and beaten up, and Mosley will stop so that everyone can watch this person being grabbed and beaten up. And it's not just men, it's women that are being beaten up, which very much offends the witnesses. And in the immediate aftermath of this rally, MI5 is essentially asked to start looking at the fascists because one of the MPs who's there was an aide to the Prime Minister, and the word goes back, these are not nice people, this is nasty, violent stuff, we need to worry about these people. So MI5 is tasked to turn its counter-subversion spotlight onto the British Union of Fascists, which is slightly tricky because one of MI5, in fact, MI5's sort of chief investigator at that point is a chap called Maxwell Knight, who is pretty much a fascist himself. And certainly that was where his sympathies were. He has excellent sources inside fascism because quite close friends of his are at the top, including the chap who is best known as Lord Haw, William Joyce, who was a good friend of Maxwell Knight, and who probably, we think Knight probably tipped Joyce off at the start of the war that he was going to be arrested, giving Joyce time to flee the country. So there's a tension here.
It's a tricky history, isn't it? It's a tricky situation for MI5, yeah.
But, Knight accepts the job, and Knight, in fact, knows that he has a young man who would be perfect to send into the British Union of Fascists, who's a fellow called Eric Roberts. And the reason that Knight knows that Eric Roberts, who is then in his mid-late 20s, has just got married and is working in a bank in London as a clerk. The reason that Knight knows that Roberts will be a perfect recruit is that Knight's recruited Roberts as a spy when both of them were members of the British Fascisti a decade earlier. And the British Fascisti is sort of the grandfather of the British Union of Fascists. And Knight had been, it's an incredibly complicated tale, but Knight had essentially been sort of spying for the British Fascisti on the communists and sort of doing it on behalf of MI5 and MI6 as well. And you can see in at least one MI5 file I found from the 20s, you can see a report that is clearly an Eric Roberts report that has been sent to Maxwell Knight that has then found its way up through the layers of the British Fascisti into MI5's files. So by this stage, Knight is a full-time employee of MI5, and he calls up Roberts and says, join the BUF, go along, be keen, don't be too keen, just be a bit keen. And actually his messages to Roberts, which Roberts kept, which he shouldn't have kept, are absolutely fascinating because they are guidance on how to be a spy.
So he's penetrating the fascists for MI5, Roberts.
Yes.
And he's got a code name, hasn't he? Agent Jack.
He doesn't have that at this point. At this point, his code name is MF, which we think all of Maxwell Knight's agents were codenamed M, and we think the F is for fascist. Oh. And MF, over the next 5 or 6 years, just becomes this tremendous source on fascism because Roberts does what he's told. He goes along, he's keen, he's helpful, he's not too keen, gets invited to things. People like Eric Roberts. He's a keen young man. He's a bright young man. You can get him to organise something for you, and he'll organise it. And he rises through the ranks. He becomes a district inspector in the BUF. He has the uniform. He leads this fascinating double life where he will leave his offices at the bank and go into a gentleman's toilets in Chelsea and change into his black shirt uniform. He got told off by a policeman at one stage for doing this, and go to the what was known as the Black House, which was the BUF's headquarters in Chelsea, and so other sources are put in as well, but Roberts is their chief and first fascist source, and then war breaks out, and the BUF are all interned.
So Roberts could face internment, couldn't he?
Well, he's safe on this one because people know who he is.
Okay, but the ordinary police officers might not know.
Yes, no, and there is clearly an issue, and he's clearly getting abuse. And Roberts wants to, in the mid-1940, Roberts wants to know what to do. The BUF have all been locked up. He has escaped internment, even though someone of his rank would usually have been interned, not necessarily, but he might well have expected to. And he wants to go and work for MI5. And helpfully, MI5 is at this point engaged in a massive expansion. And what they want is someone who understands fascism. And there is the starting point for everyone with this story is the Eric Roberts file, which opens with this fantastic internal and external exchange. The internal exchange is a memo between two MI5 officers, one of them saying, I understand you're looking for somebody who knows about fascism. There is this chap, Eric Roberts. Maxwell Knight has the highest opinion of his abilities, and he is intimately acquainted with the entire fascist architecture. That's quite interesting. And the second one, and much funnier one, is a letter from Roberts' employer at the Westminster Bank to the Director General of MI5, Jasper Harker, which says, in effect, we understand that you want to have this chat for special war work, and obviously, the Westminster Bank will give you anyone you need at this time of vital national importance. But we would be enormously grateful if you would tell us why you want this man, because we can't see any value to him at all.
Oh, interesting, yeah.
And what was his value? That's what started me down this road. What was it about Eric Roberts that was so special? What were his special qualities that his employer had not been able to perceive, as they put it? And what it was partly, obviously, in fact, he had been working for MI5 on quite a reasonable rate of pay at this point for 6 years. He knows everyone who's anyone in fascism. His member, there are obviously all these sort of little fringe groups, and whenever you find one of the memberships of the fringe groups, you look down the list, and there is Eric Roberts on it. He was a very good joiner. But his real quality sort of becomes clear once he's working full-time for MI5, which is that he's incredibly likable. So he's very quickly sent to, although the BUF has been sort of officially broken up and interned, MI5 is still worried that there are lots of fringe groups floating about. And the thing to understand is that in 1940, everyone is trying to get their heads around how it was that the Nazis have been able to advance so fast. So at the start of 1940, the Nazis have conquered Poland. By the middle of 1940, they conquered France and the Low Countries and Norway and...
very swift.
Yeah,
invasion,
very swift.
Yeah.
Achieved what Germany hadn't achieved 30 years before, and the British army has had to retreat in disarray, leaving its guns on the beach. How have they done this? And the explanation that's offered is that the fascists have what are called fifth columnists, which is an idea that started in the Spanish Civil War, that there are people working behind the lines to help your advance. And Neville Bland, who is the British ambassador to The Hague, just makes it out in time and comes back and I think not far from here actually, sits in his club and scrawls this description of how it was that the Germans had taken the Netherlands. And it's and he describes how kitchen maids were signalling paratroopers in and cutting the wires and blowing up train lines and all sorts of things. It's all rubbish, okay? It's all rubbish, but it's absolutely believed. And it's believed about Norway as well. And in Norway, of course, there's this issue with Quisling, who's a minister in the government, who sort of does invite the Germans in. And again, that's not why they won, but all sorts of rumours. So if you had asked somebody in 1940, how did the Germans take Norway, they would have said, well, the troops were ordered to stand down and this was turned off and that was turned off. And it's not really true, but it's absolutely believed. And so the issue then becomes, well, if they had fifth columnists in France and they had fifth columnists in the Netherlands and they had fifth columnists in Norway, do they have fifth columnists here?
In Britain, yeah.
And that's why the BUF would be the obvious place you would look for them. Those people are, actual fascists. So you lock up their leaders. But what about the ordinary BUF members? And so the attitude at MI5 is summed up quite well by a memo that somebody writes that says, it's our job to ensure that every person within the fortress is loyal. So Britain is a fortress, and it's our job to make sure that everybody here is loyal. And that's actually talking about millions of people. And there are all of the issues about what do you do. Britain is then as now an open market economy. There are thousands of Germans living here who've made their homes here. There are thousands of Italians living here who've made their home here. What do we do with them? And there are all sorts of internal rows going on about this. But then, there are these British people who are loyal to this fascist cause. Can we trust them? And Roberts is the man who is sent to worm his way into these groups and to try and establish the answer to this question.
So how does he do that?
Well, the first one he goes to is a bunch of people in Leeds, and he sort of says, look, I'm kind of the continuity BUF. Can we talk about what you're up to? And I think that the Leeds case it's a small case, and none of the people in it are terribly important. But I think it's really interesting because middle of 1940, Eric Roberts turns up in Leeds, introduces himself to these people, and about a month later, for various reasons, there's a miscommunication, and two of them come down to London to try to find him, and they go to the bank where he said he works. Mm-hmm. And the bank says, no, he went to work for the army. He's joined the army. He doesn't work here anymore. And then they go to the home address he gave them, and nobody's heard of him there. And at the same time as this, somebody tips them off that their letters are being opened. A postman tips them off that their letters are being opened. So they know they're being watched. They know that somebody started watching them since this man turned up. Right. They know that he lied about who he is. They lied about where he works. They lied about where he lives. And so when he next meets them, there is a certain amount of understandable suspicion, but he talks them round. He talks them round because people liked Eric Roberts. He's just this intensely likeable man. I interviewed his son-in-law, who said to me, and it was very memorable, he said, he was my best friend. Yeah. And I liked my father-in-law. I would never, I don't know anyone who would describe their father-in-law as their best friend, if you see what I mean. People really liked Eric Roberts. And because they liked him, they trusted him.
In spite of what the evidence told them.
In spite of what the evidence... Yeah. And even when these people in Leeds were arrested, and the transcripts of their interviews are in the National Archive, even when they've been arrested, and the one person who hasn't been arrested is this man who they met, who lied to them, they still don't suspect him. You can see in the transcripts they're trying to work out who it was who ratted on them. And they've got all of these theories, and their theories continue. They it can't have been him. So
that's fascinating.
So he was just this perfect natural spy, because if you like someone, it's very hard to suspect them. And
didn't MI5 also eavesdrop on some of the conversations? Tell me about that.
Separate to this, MI5 has recruited a chap called Victor Rothschild, who is the third Baron Rothschild of the Rothschilds you've heard of, one of the richest men in the country. But he's not very interested in the Rothschild Bank. He's a scientist, and he has been recruited as their chief scientific advisor, because he, as he puts it, MI5 is scientifically subhuman. They're sort of aware that this is going to be a war of science and this is going to be a war of manufacture. But most of the people they're recruiting are law professors and history professors, and they don't really, and you can see it in their memos, they don't really understand this whole building stuff business. World War II is a war of manufacture. It's about tanks and planes and ships and guns and how fast can you build them and can you get them to the right place, and MI5 is supposed to be securing all of that, and it just doesn't understand it. So Victor Rothschild is brought in to explain it to them, and he does a very good job. And he starts to suspect that there is a nest of spies at Siemens, which is it's a sort of reasonable search. Siemens is a German scientific company. If you were trying to spy on the British, they would be a really good place to do it, because their salesmen spent their whole time sort of wandering in and out of British factories trying to sell people machine tools. So they know where the factories are and they know what the capabilities of the factories are. So Rothschild suspects this and sends Eric Roberts in to see if he could, to sort of the Siemens community, to trail his coat. Yeah. And see if he can get recruited. And he can't find a nest of Siemens spies. But what he does find, and what MI5 keeps finding, is people who want to be spies.
Oh, that's interesting. Yeah.
And they conclude that there isn't a fifth column by the end of 41. They think the Germans just weren't organised here. They weren't expecting to advance this fast. Look at the quality of the spies they have been sending. Most of them get arrested, immediately on landing, just because they're not very good. We don't think there was an organised network, they conclude. But there are all these people who would really like to be in contact with them. And Rothschild says, well, if we've got these people who would really like to be German spies, if only they could find a network to work for, maybe we should give them a network.
Oh, no, seriously?
So Roberts is told, Roberts, who has been pretending under the name Jack King for various reasons, because he can't work as Eric Roberts, because that name is sort of compromised, because Eric Roberts is a known member of the British Union of Fascists, and is somewhat suspect for not having been locked up. And some people are starting to wonder, in the, as it were, the fascist community, are starting to wonder about him. So for various reasons, he is set up under the code name, under the false name Jack King, which is where the Agent Jack title comes from. And Jack King has been pretending to be another wannabe spy, hoping someone would recruit him, and he has to sort of pull off this switch, which again most people would have struggled to do, but he manages, of turning around and saying, actually, when I said to you I knew nothing about this, I was lying. I am actually the Gestapo's man in London.
Oh wow! So
and he's given a little pass that I think MI6 made for him. that sort of says, because they're sending people into German territory, so they've got the forgers, that says, you know, this man works for the Gestapo group in London, and he sort of reveals himself as a Gestapo agent to a woman called Marita Perigo, who is another amazing character, who is a very, very determined fascist. And she, upon discovering that she finally has, as she thinks, a connection to Berlin, she sets about building the Fifth Column network. And within months, they are the Marita Perigo file is a file is about that thick, a volume of files about that thick. Her file is growing at the rate of a volume a month, which she's bringing in intelligence and she is bringing in recruits, largely sort of based on people she knew from fascist circles before the war. She brings in several of her friends. In order to monitor them, they set Roberts up in a flat in Park West near Hyde Park, and this will intrigue you because this is your area. They wire the flat for sound, which is not something MI5 did very much of. Or normally, what MI5 does at this stage is it has a bug. I think normally in the phones.
Okay, yeah.
Certainly the bugs are put in by the post office who run the phone network, and if you sort of think about it, a bug in a room like this in the 1940s, the microphones are not what they are. Microphones are not like this. They're relatively large, and they have to have a big wire attached to them. And the obvious place to hide a microphone with a big wire attached to it in the middle of a room is a telephone. Because it's there already. So, and normally they would run that to another room where you'd have a couple of special branch chaps doing shorthand.
Literally just sat there.
Just sat there listening. Yeah. But what they, because that would normally work for a sort of for a one-off meeting, and there are plenty of files like that in the archive, because. What Rothschild has in mind is a much more industrial effort. They have proper recording devices, probably recording on records, which was the sort of the dominant recording technology in Britain at the time. We don't know where, frustratingly, the recording people are. If this starts to sound familiar to some people, Kate Atkinson's novel Transcription it's based on this operation, and it imagines that the transcribers are actually in the room next door. It's
whole world.
If you're interested in this, it's a great book, and she writes about the women who are sitting there listening to these recordings and typing out the transcripts, and the transcripts are still in the archive. There's a huge file of and it's just a selection of the sort of key meetings. But so in this flat in Park West, which is wired for sound, he starts meeting people that Marita Perigo brings along, and I don't know how many other transcripts there are of people being recruited as spies in real life. But there are at least 2 occasions in this file where somebody is brought in and Robert says, "I understand your 2-hour way of thinking." And the person says, yes.
It's extraordinary, isn't it?
It's incredible. It's incredible. And you can see the delicacy of his approach, because there's a very strong kind of, well, I don't want you to do anything you're uncomfortable with. You just have to. But if you did want to help the fatherland, You know, I mean, these are the kinds of things that we will be interested in. But, you know, you must decide for yourself.
It's turning everything on its head, isn't it? It's recruiting them to a false network that doesn't actually exist. And he pulls it off.
And by the end of the war, there's kind of concentric circles. Nobody in this is a conscious agent, in the sense that nobody, apart from Roberts, knows that they're actually working for MI5.
But that's the irony, isn't it?
Putting that aside, there are people like Marita who believe themselves to be working for the Gestapo, who are conscious. And then beyond that, there are friends of theirs and their wider circle who, to some degree or other, suspect that Marita has some kind of line to Berlin, and who aren't necessarily inquiring too closely about what that is, but who, for instance, are not turning her in. And then beyond that, there are the people that they're in contact with who are completely unconscious, but who nevertheless MI5 wants to keep an eye on. And because of the nature of this, it becomes incredibly useful. So there is, for instance, in East London, there's a group called the German Club, which is attached to a German-speaking church, and after the Sunday service, they all meet and they talk, and there's obviously solidarity and community. And quite naturally, MI5 is quite keen to know what the German Club is up to in the middle of the war against Germany. But you can't put an agent in, because if somebody pops up and says, hello, I've come to join the German Club, people, well, how have you just got here? And they would immediately be the subject of suspicion. But MI5 don't need to put anyone in, because one of the people who is reporting to Roberts is a member of the German Club. So she is passing on. Oh well, so and so says this, and so says he really hopes the British lose. He's so angry about what happened, to Hamburg or whatever, and so says that they would be willing to hide a spy, and these, all of these people, each time a file is opened on them, and their risk is assessed, and a lot of them, you do start to get into this interesting question of what is the definition of treachery. If you say to me, well, I hope Germany wins, I mean, actually, there was a point in 1940 where you would have been jailed for that. But most people would probably take the view that simply thinking something, in Britain we don't lock people up for thinking things or even for saying them. On the whole, we sort of think people have to do something, and so there's this row develops within MI5 about what's called provocation. If, for instance, I said to you, Helen, don't you wish that Germany would win? And you said yes, people might say, well, she wouldn't have said that if she hadn't been encouraged. And if I said to you, Helen, would you mind terribly photographing the papers that cross your desk? And you said yes. Again, there's an interesting question about whether you would have come up with the idea on your own. And one of the lines that Roberts has to walk, and doesn't always manage successfully, because it's basically impossible to walk this line successfully, is to be receptive to people without being, as it was called, an agent provocateur, which the British, I mean, it's worth remembering, the Gestapo has no problem with sending in provocation agents, and the Gestapo the real Gestapo has no problem with locking people up on the basis of things that they have said and thought.
Absolutely, yeah.
MI5 is supposed to be holding itself to different standards, and the Home Office is very keen to hold MI5 to different standards, and we will come to one of the reasons why this operation stayed secret for so long, but a lot of it is about the fact that lots of people in MI5 feel...
Right,
so lots of people in MI5
yeah.
feel this is quite shifty. They feel they shouldn't be doing this. But Guy Liddell, who I mentioned earlier, who by this stage is in charge of sort of counter-espionage and counter-sabotage for MI5, he says, look, we know about the man who waves a swastika in his back garden. What we need to know about is the man who waves a swastika inside his house. And there is just no way of knowing this without doing things like this. But it has to be said that when Rothschild starts this operation with Roberts, both he and Guy Liddell think that this might be the first of a number of operations like this that they could run around the country. And they are so shocked by the number of people that Roberts brings in, when he lifts the stone of, you know, who in Britain has fascist sympathies.
Do we have an idea of numbers?
There are hundreds on their books.
Yeah.
And this is one man. And as I say, most of these people are not conscious. But there are dozens who are conscious. Small dozens, but dozens. When they lift the rock up, they are so horrified by what they find that they decide they're not turning over any other rocks, as it were. So they sort of let Roberts run because he's bringing in all of this great stuff, and particularly because he's doing it in London. He's got people who are inside various other continuity fascist operations. There isn't much in British fascism that happens in 1943 that Roberts doesn't end up reporting on. And even the people in MI5 who were hostile to the operation and the approach quite rapidly sort of come around to the view that, well, everything he brings in is confirmed and corroborated, and we're not getting this stuff anywhere else. And we kind of want to know about these people.
So he's bringing in intelligence which MI5 needed.
Yes,
essentially.
absolutely.
So he's hugely successful.
Yeah, no. So he's massively. So by the end of the war, British fascism is sort of a wholly owned subsidiary of MI5. And there's a
that's the irony, isn't it?
They're facing this. There isn't much you can do as a fascist, certainly as a fascist in London, where you will not at some point find yourself talking to someone who then goes and reports that conversation back to Eric Roberts.
During your research, tell me finally about the medal, because you had a very interesting incident, didn't you, during the writing of your book?
So the problem that the MI5 has at the end of the war is, what do you do with these people?
Yeah.
Do you lock them up? Do you just warn them off? Do you call them in and say, we think you ought to know that we've been watching you the whole time? Do you? At one point, they suggest they float the idea that they could set up their own fascist party, which Roberts would be the leader of, and they decide against that. But that shows you the level of their thinking. And in the end, they conclude, well, you don't know in 1945 who your next enemy is going to be. But it might be fascism, and we're tremendously well plugged into fascism. Why not just sort of let this operation run on? And so they do. And in order to keep his key agent sweet, Eric Roberts has there's this extraordinary moment in 1946 where he meets two of his key agents, Marita Perigo and a man called Hans Kohout. And Hans Kohout, I think, has a strong claim to have been the best German spy in Britain during the war. He brings in genuine intelligence. He brings in details of the mosquito bomber. He brings the first night vision equipment. He brings Operation Window, the chaff that is being thrown out of RAF planes. He even, at one stage, goes to Roberts and says, there's something going on at this country house outside London called Bletchley Park. I should really go and have a look at it. And they had the sort of frantic warning off operation. No, don't. We're not interested. So Roberts meets Perigo and Kohout and presents them with German medals. And this is January 1946. So I think these are the last German medals awarded in World War II.
So they're fake medals, aren't
Well,
they?
it's not clear. There were quite a lot of them floating about. Rothschild spent about 6 months trying to get hold of them. There's a discussion about whether to fake them, but it's quite possible they were actually genuine medals that somebody had sort of picked up over in Germany. There's a lot of correspondence, but it's not quite clear what the outcome is. But the medals, these are the last medals of World War II, awarded by, as it were, the Germans. And they are handed to two people who never contacted a German agent, in reality, by a British spy who was working for one of Britain's leading Jews. And I knew that this had happened. So, and Marita says, oh, I'm going to hide my medal in the stuffing of my armchair. And I went to interview Hans Kohaut's son. We spent the afternoon, I talked him through his father's file, and he said, well, this is very difficult for me to take in. Obviously, you've sort of completely changed my view of my father, my understanding of who he was. But it does explain this. And he produces his father's medal.
Oh my goodness!
Which he had, when his father died, he's going through his desk, and he finds this medal, and he says to his mother, Hans Kohaut's wife, "What's this?" And she knew that Hans Kohaut. Well, she knew, as it were, that Hans Kohaut had spent the war as a German spy. She didn't know the truth, and she, thinking very quickly, they were Austrian family, said, oh, well, that was your grandfather's for long service on the Austrian railway. And Hans thought it was funny, so it's been hanging on his toilet wall.
Oh, and he had no idea.
He had no idea. And it was, I mean, for me, it was the first solid evidence that all of this was real. Because you're dealing in the files, and you're sitting there thinking, this is so extraordinary, it's such an extraordinary story. Is this all a figment of their imagination or my imagination? Am I going mad?
Is it true? Yeah.
Then that was the first solid thing that I could hold that said, actually, this is completely real. And this chap kept this treasured medal in his drawer. The other moment was when they initially met. They met in a basement from an antiques shop on the Marylebone High Street, and I sort of I realised that actually the antique shop had moved, but was still in business and still run by the same family. And I phoned them up on spec and just said, look, I'm writing this book about this rather odd thing that happened during the war. And the chap at the other end said, oh, the spy's in Dad's basement.
Oh, wow.
And there's this sort of family legend that spies had met that his father had been a special constable, and MI5 had needed somewhere to hold a meeting, and because he was trustworthy and sort of had the right kind of place, he'd been approached. And so there's this family legend that a nest of spies had met in the basement, but nothing else was known apart from that. So
you've been able to shine a light on that.
Yes. So you're sort of going around solving people's family mysteries.
Finally, Rob, can I ask you, why do you think it's important that stories like this should be told in the National Centre for Military Intelligence?
Britain has told itself a story about World War II, and actually World War II is sort of modern Britain's origin myth. And part of that is this idea that there's the idea that Britain stood alone, and there is the idea that other nations might give in to fascism, but that's not really a British thing. And you can see this. People quite routinely say, oh, well, we never really had fascists here. We did have fascists here. And we wouldn't have done that stuff. To be honest, the one part of the British Isles that was occupied, the Channel Islands, they fairly cheerfully handed over their Jews. There was a complex history there, but it's not at all clear that British people would have behaved better under occupation than French people behaved or Dutch people behaved, there would have been heroes and there would have been villains. And in a sense, we know that there would have been villains because we've got the transcripts of their recording. I know for damn certain that if the Nazis had occupied Britain, Marita Perigo would very cheerfully have helped round up Jews. Nancy Brown would have very cheerfully helped round up Jews. And these people, you know, sort of went and lived their lives, and they never had any idea that they had been on MI5's books. What this story tells us is that British people are just like everyone else. There are good people. There are people like Eric Roberts who did dangerous, brave stuff. And there are people like Marita Perigo who would very cheerfully have betrayed her country. And there are people like Hans Kohout, who is an Austrian living in Britain, trying to work out where his loyalties lie. And we need to understand that we are all complex and human and strong and weak. And I think that this is what that story tells us.
Rob, thank you for sharing about Agent Jack today and for your honesty, and you've given us a lot to think about. Thank you for doing that for the National Centre for Military Intelligence.
Absolute pleasure.
This has been a production for the National Centre for Military Intelligence. To find out more and to support the NCMI, please visit ncmi.co.uk.